just completely ruined that coffee sequence. The point was to show you, or prove to Patrick Rambles mainly, that I don't just drink instant coffee. But what you really care about is how I've been getting on with the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Just gonna go and finish this horrible cup of coffee. You might remember a couple of weeks back I put out a request for some help with reviewing the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Loads of you got involved, thank you very much if you did. There were so many responses that I can't really cover all of them, unfortunately. But I did see some commonalities, and I think it comes down to three things that people want to know about this phone. The first is how much better is this iPhone 14 Pro Max than earlier iPhones? And by that you clearly mean the likes of the iPhone 12, the iPhone 11, and even earlier than that. And most reviews have focused, understandably, on the upgrade from the 13 Pro to the 14 Pro. But very few people are doing that. So if you're sitting on an older iPhone, is this worth it? That's the first one. The second one is the camera any good? What does that 48 megapixel sensor mean? Is it going to give me better photos? And lastly, people want to know how this phone feels different to older iPhones. Do you get a sense of value for money? Is it worth it, basically? These are all very fair questions. I intend to answer them for you today. I've been using this solidly for 2 weeks. I know that's not very long still, but come on guys, this is YouTube. So let's dig into it. Firstly, a very quick word from today's sponsor, which is Pitaka, who have sent me 3 of their lovely Mag Easy Case 3s. Now, I am a big fan of Pitaka, and I've also realised that I do need to keep my iPhone 14 Pro Max as encased and protected as possible. And what I love about these cases from Pitaka is that firstly, they look fantastic. I've got 3 different versions they sent me, which I can show you here, but I like this one in particular. This is the, what's this called? It's the Fusion Weaving version, which is just very nice. But the cool thing about these cases is that they encase all the important bits of the phone, but they don't go too far. So you don't get that horrible lip that you get on some cases, which spoils the experience of the iPhone. It means you've got this thing on the end of the screen that your thumb keeps hitting, and there's nothing at the bottom at all, which I know does leave this part exposed, but at least you get to see the lovely design of the iPhone. And because the rest of the case is so well built, that doesn't bother me at all. And it is very, very tough. It's made from 1500D and 600D aramid fibre. No idea what that is, but it does sound very impressive. And it's got lovely touches like this metal that goes around the camera housing to protect those very important lenses. It's also, I'm told, the world's thinnest and lightest MagSafe compatible case. There's some chamfered stuff going on, there's no sharp edges, there's absolutely no gaps, it fits the phone perfectly. It just hugs it just enough. It's also good for the environment. All of the packaging that these things come in are clearly recycled and just look very nice. And yeah, you're doing your bit for the planet if you buy Pitaka cases as well, which is always a bonus. And it's also worth noting that these cases are compatible with the Pitaflow Pitaka system. I've got that throughout the studio. I've got it over here in the form of a stand for my iPad mini, which is fantastic. I highly recommend these cases. If you want to check them out yourself, I'll put a link in the description. And thank you, Pitaka, for sponsoring this video, but also making sure that I don't break my iPhone 14 Pro Max. So let's start with that first question. Is the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max better than, let's say, the iPhone 11 Pro and 12 Pro? Now, admittedly, I only have an iPhone 12 Pro to compare it against, but the list is pretty unavoidable. You're getting a better battery, a better, brighter screen, a much better camera, and also you're getting 2 features which are genuinely new, the Dynamic Island and also the always-on display. Now sure, it doesn't look any different to the iPhone 12 or iPhone 11 Pro, but it does feel different. There is one caveat with this, which is that iOS 16 is different enough thanks to that new lock screen to make your old iPhone feel a bit newer, but it's still not quite like getting this new one. The other thing to bear in mind is that your iPhone 11 even probably won't feel slow compared to this. Apple Silicon is so good. It's so powerful, so light years ahead of everything else, and it's so designed perfectly for these devices that they last a long time, and the speed doesn't diminish as quickly as it does on other phones. But as I mentioned a moment ago, there are 2 features which undeniably make this feel like a considerably newer phone. We'll start with Dynamic Island because everyone is talking about Dynamic Island. Let's forget about the name, we've all had a good laugh at that. It's okay. And that's the point really. I think we need to remember that Dynamic Island is in its infancy. It's not really worth getting upset about at the moment because it's still, well, it's just a different version of the notch that does some cool things. And no, it doesn't intrude on video viewing. So if you're watching a video landscape like that, you don't see it unless you zoom into the video, which I don't know why people do that. If you do that, you're missing half the frame. And you don't spot it that much. The only stuff that I see Dynamic Island do, I've made some notes, is Face ID confirmations, charging, AirDrop, Apple TV remote. Our niece tried to eat the physical one, so we have to use our phones. Music playback, timers. That's about it. Oh, and one very cool thing about Dynamic Island that I don't think anyone else has either spotted or talked about is the fact that when music goes up into the Dynamic Island, you get that little graphic equalizer thing that kind of bounces up and down. It's actually live and reacting to the music that's being played, which is really cool because quite often those little graphics are just animations. This actually responds to the audio, and also the colour of it matches the album art. It's not all a bed of roses on Dynamic Island. There are some strange omissions, the most obvious one being the stopwatch. So unlike the timer, which disappears into Dynamic Island, the stopwatch doesn't. It just disappears. I can't quite work that out. Some third-party apps do have an issue with Dynamic Island as well. That's unsurprising. You know, this is a brand new feature. Developers are having to catch up and make sure their app is compatible with it. But it is early days for Dynamic Island. It's not really worth getting upset about, guys, I have to say. But the crucial thing about it, like I said in my original review, is that it feels new. It's that fresh out-of-the-box thing that we haven't had with an iPhone for years. Next up is the always-on display, which I can demonstrate here. There you go. That is the always-on display on the new iPhone 14 Pro Max. A lot of people are quite angry about this, or fairly indifferent, or just completely unimpressed. Kind of get that, because it is a strange always-on display. It's well, I suppose it lives up to its name. It is literally always on. So unlike Android phones, you don't just get the time in like a very small font. You get pretty much everything you get when it's on anyway. So you see the time, your widgets, wallpaper, notifications, and while it's quite nice to have that stuff glanceable all the time, it is distracting. It does impact the battery life as well, there's no question about that, and it is noticeable. Now, as always, I've not done stringent tests with this with numbers and bar graphs and charts and things, but I did run the phone with the always-on display turned on for a week, and then with it turned off for a week. With it turned on, the phone runs down quicker for some reason in the morning. So I'd get to lunchtime and it would have about 60% battery remaining. With the always display turned off, it would basically get to lunchtime with about 80% remaining. Now, I don't know if that's enough to be concerned about because this is still going to get you through a day and a half, potentially 2 days, no problem at all. This is the Pro Max, by the way. Can't speak for the Pro. But again, this always-on display, which I think we're going to see some tweaks to. Apple's not stupid, they're watching this, they're seeing all of this coverage that it's getting, which isn't particularly glowing, and I think we'll get some options to turn things off, darken it more potentially. But it is a new feature, and again, a little bit like the Dynamic Island, it makes the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max feel like a very new device, particularly if you're coming from an iPhone 11 Pro or 12 Pro. It's a similar story with the iPhone 13 Pro as well, obviously, because that doesn't have the Dynamic Island or the always-on display. But that's where we get to the camera. Now, firstly, I'm not going to talk about pixel binning in this video. I thought about it, and then I thought, 1, I don't care. 2, knowing my audience, you probably don't care. And 3, clearly, you just want an answer to a very simple question. Does it take better photos than those older iPhones? And if so, what are the benefits? Spoiler, it does. And that is because of this 48 megapixel sensor. Whatever is going on behind the scenes doesn't matter unless you're into that stuff. And if you are, fantastic, I don't blame you at all. It's worth going to check out what pixel binning is and what that means for the 12 megapixel images and the Pro RAW and all that stuff. But if you don't care about that and you just want to know that you're going to be spending 1,300 quid on a phone, you want to know that those photos are worth some of that money. And that 48 megapixel sensor has a number of benefits. One of them is better light capture, so it brings more light onto that sensor. That means better low light photography, which is just useful in everyday life. And secondly, it gives you much better background blur, much more professional looking background blur like you might see behind me now. This is from a proper camera, proper lens. You also get another zoom option now, which is this 2x, which is basically, and okay, I'll get into the weeds a little bit with this. This is basically taking the middle part of that 48 megapixel, the 12 megapixels within it, and using that as a focal length. So now on the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max, we have 0.5, which is the ultra wide, but we also have 1x, 2x, and 3x, and that is more useful than you might think. And if you're really that way inclined, you can shoot full 48 megapixel raw images, which gives you loads of creative control in the edit suite. So let's look at a few comparison photos between the iPhone 12 Pro and the iPhone 14 Pro Max. So on the face of it, some of these photos look pretty much identical, but I think the iPhone 12 Pro often looks a bit more sharpened, a little bit more contrasty. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the areas in which you'll see one of the biggest impacts from that large new sensor is the background blur, or bokeh as it's sometimes called. And you can see here on this shot of these leaves, the background on the iPhone 14 Pro Max shot, I think, looks a bit more natural. The blur looks far more naturally created by that sensor and lens combination. I took a selfie as well, and this isn't the best comparison, to be honest. The 12 Pro that I'm using has got a welded on screen protector, which isn't fantastic, but trust me, the difference in quality between the selfies on that phone and the new iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max is quite significant. I think this one's a great example of the better colour reproduction on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. It just looks more natural to me if you look at the colour of the leaves and that flower. And both phones handle white balance very differently. I think the 14 Pro Max does a much better job of nailing it each time. So if you look at these two images here, the one on the right is what I saw pretty much with my own eyes. But it's the detail you get from that bigger sensor as well. So the other huge benefit of having a 48 megapixel sensor is that it is capturing more detail. And that means you can zoom in, crop things more, and not lose the quality of the image. You can see here from this lovely shot of the ground that there's just so much more detail once we've zoomed in on the iPhone 14 Pro Max, whereas on the iPhone 12 Pro, the image starts to break up. I think the lenses are a lot sharper as well. You can see that here on the BMW logo. Normally the iPhone 12 Pro will just over sharpen the image a little bit, whereas the 14 Pro Max has just nailed that in terms of the clarity and the sharpness of that wheel. And when it comes to portrait mode, there is literally no battle. I mean, if you look at these two images, it was very difficult to get these shot in the same way, to kind of compose it the same way, and that's because of that 24mm lens on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Both phones have great dynamic range, so they deal very well with scenes where there's quite a lot of dark and light stuff going on at the same time. And again, in this one, you can see that much nicer background blur on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. And then there's macro mode, which you don't get on the 12 Pro or any iPhones before that. And that means you can get much, much closer to subjects. You can get stupidly close, obviously, but in this example, I've just gone tighter on that flower, and it's just a nicer image. When it comes to video, the quality of the 4K video on both the iPhone 12 Pro and the 14 Pro Max is about the same. But the iPhone 14 Pro Max absolutely, and the Pro obviously, absolutely smashes the 12 Pro in two areas. The first one is image stabilization. So this is me walking down the road normally, swinging my arms a little bit, holding the cameras, and well, you can see it's just much smoother on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. But if you turn on the new action mode, it gets really silly. So this is me now running down the road, and well, look, there's just no competition. And that action mode is really, really good, and it's genuinely useful day to day. So this is me trying to capture the dog. I'm basically running backwards, trying not to trip over, trying to keep him in frame. And obviously doing that, I'm kind of moving up and down quite a bit. You can't tell. The other huge benefit of going from the iPhone 12 Pro to the 14 Pro is that you get cinematic mode. Now this wouldn't have mattered 12 months ago because the first version of cinematic mode on the iPhone 13 Pro is pretty terrible. But now we get it in 4K, and I do think they've improved the algorithm and all the clever computational stuff that's going on behind the scenes. It's really fun to play around with, and I think it looks much better than before. So is the camera on the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max better than the iPhone 13 Pro? A little bit. Is it better than the iPhone 12 Pro and iPhones from before that? Massively. If you're coming from an older iPhone, I think the camera and also the screen improvements, don't forget, above and beyond the dynamic island and the always on display, you're getting a 2000 nits brightness screen on this, which, trust me, in direct sunlight is incredible. But I think those two things alone make this a worthwhile upgrade from those older iPhones. And I have spoken to 2 or 3 people who have made that leap, so they've gone from the, let's say, iPhone 12 Pro to the 14 Pro, and they're absolutely delighted. So I think if you've been umming and erring about this decision, we can keep it pretty simple, guys. If you're coming from an earlier iPhone than the iPhone 13 Pro, this is going to feel like money very well spent. It's a great phone for those upgrades. If you're coming from the 13 Pro, not so much. In fact, I'd save yourself some money and get yourself some AirPods Pro 2. If you haven't done that, and if you don't know why I'm saying that, keep watching for a link to a review that I wasn't going to make, but I'm glad I did, because it's one of Apple's products of the year. Enjoy your upgrade if you go for it, but whatever you do, keep watching for my full AirPods Pro 2 review.